Hi, I'm here at the Whiskey Show with Luke.
Hi.
Hi, and then Robert was this regional sales manager
Indeed.
in the UK. Five things we did not know about
Five things you five things you didn't know about Ben Roma. Right. Okay. So for most people, a lot of people won't know that Ben Romack is owned by Gordon and MacPhail, so the Urquhart family. We took the distillery over in 1993. It was originally a distillery that had been mothballed in the early 80s, 83, by United Distillers, so Diageo as it is now. And it had been dormant for 10 years before we bought it in 1993. Spent 5 years doing it up, and then brought it back to life by laying down the first casks under that ownership from 1998. Second thing I suppose most people don't realise is it's now a lightly peated Speyside whisky. So most people, when you think of Speyside whisky, don't historically think of peat or smoke. No, it's only 12 parts per million in terms of the phenol levels, so very light and with Highland peat. So it doesn't have the same medicinal quality that you'll find with perhaps Isla peat. Doesn't have that same sort of big peat reek and isn't as it has the same intensity. It's more of a smoky bonfire ember kind of smoke that comes through. So it creates a really nice, well balanced, lightly smoky style of whiskey, which is again quite an unusual USP. It's based on a pre-1960s style of Speyside whiskey. So when the family were looking at what sort of style to bring into the new ownership, they wanted to make a few subtle changes. And having been independently bottling as Gordon and MacPhail for many years, they had a wonderful cask library of samples for Speyside over many years, back to 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, right the way back through generations. And that allowed them to try lots of different samples, and some of those samples actually back then, pre-1960s, had a little smoky note to them. And there were a number of factors for that. A lot to do with, I suppose, during wartime, after wartime, when sort of fuel sort of resources and things that I suppose either been depleted or were being rationed and things at the time. If people were still distilling, a number of distilleries were utilising peat, to also sort of feed that production process, and that was obviously being translated into the grains and ultimately into the whiskey itself. So sort of 20 years sort of down the line, when cask samples were being tried, these smoky notes came up, and nobody was doing this sort of a smoky whiskey in Speyside in the 90s. It just wasn't a core zone of expression. So it was something more of a USP that they could bring back to life, and so it just did something very unique. So fascinating. So. Yeah, I guess with that we also have now a first fill cask policy. I think not that many people know that. So we don't use refill casks. We don't use STR, shaved, toasted, rechar casks, things like that. It's always a first fill cask policy that we have. So that's always been so that's always been the case and stuff like that from the first fill policy. To bring in, and something that we kind of continue now, very obsessively and stuff like that with our core range. We have two parts really to the range. I guess we have a core range with the 10-year-old, the 15-year-old, the 21-year-old cask strength, variable batches that we do for those. But we also do one called the contrasts range, and that's where Keith Cruikshank, our master distiller, gets to play around with some unusual expressions. So another thing that people might not know is that we created the world's first fully certified organic single malt Scotch whiskey back in 2006. So that was a really interesting one at the time. So the organic as still continues to this day, has been very popular. So that's been something interesting that forms part of that range, along with a more heavily peated version that we do, which is the peat smoke edition. That we do in bourbon cask for the majority, but occasionally a limited release in sherry cask sort of finishes as well. So a really nice series of expressions from the distillery, lots and lots of different sort of variants, but from a distillery that has two very small stills, 7,500 litres and stuff like that, so the capacity for washing and spirit. And ultimately everything, the message is very handcrafted that we do. So we use that term, you hear it a lot nowadays, but for Ben Romack, everything really is done by hand. There's no fancy computers controlling anything. It's still very much done by levers and steam and pulling, sort of knobs, and by ultimately the distiller's sight and taste and sound, and everything is really hands-on. So they're very, very passionate team, very old school distilling, very old fashioned, very, very small sort of capacity, but ultimately create some fantastic whiskey. So
Elegant and smoky and
yeah.
sweet at the same time.
Yeah, so a real nice balance. So
Thank
excellent.
you so
So I hope that
much.
works. And everybody, Slanchavar, appreciate it. Cheers.
Yeah. A little bit of that.